welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
This is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and I am really excited because this is like one of my favorite things that happens sometimes, where we'll interview someone and then we'll sort of like something will come up in the interview and we'll be like, you know what, like we don't have enough time to talk about that. And then after the interview, I'll talk to the interviewee and I'll be like, so do you want to come back and talk about that? And now it's happening. So please, why don't you tell everybody who you are and what we are going to talk about today?
My name is Sara Flannery Murphy. I'm the author of The Possessions and Girl One, and I am really excited to chat about genre fiction today.
This is one of my favorite subjects of all time. And the last time we spoke about Girl One, which was awesome, which was just a really cool book in general. And it was genre fiction. It was sci-fi, but I don't think it wasn't like what people consider hard sci-fi. It was more speculative a little bit, I suppose.
That's really what I considered it. And it's really tricky for me as an author. I don't know if there are authors who there must be authors who just sit down and very much are like, I'm writing in this genre. I'm going to follow these genre conventions and really respect them. My suspicion is that more authors than not are a little bit more like me, where you kind of tell the story and the genre almost comes a little bit later in a funny way. It sounds weird to say that, but when I look at genre, and I've been thinking a lot more about genre over the past few weeks in preparation for this, and just like trying to take all my like readerly, writerly thoughts and make them more specific. I don't know. I really do feel as if a lot of different writers and a lot of different books that I wouldn't necessarily consider like genre blending really do have multiple sets of other genres. When I was trying to narrow it down, I was like, wow, there are like a lot of genre blending books when you look at it from a certain angle. Yeah, I almost reached like this point of like semantic saturation or something, where I was like, I don't even know what a genre is anymore. Like, I'm looking at these different books and I'm like, okay, it could be crime. It could also be, it also has elements of romance. It also has elements of mystery. It also has elements of suspense, and yeah, I kind of got into this state where I stopped like even understanding what genre is, which could actually be a result of living and writing and reading in the specific time that I'm in, because I think I don't know if you've seen that as a librarian, but feels like, I think
in a way it's kind of strange to think about it this way, but genre to me is sort of has seemingly taken off during what seems to almost be like a literal genre specific timeline that we're in, like this whole idea of pandemic and pandemic life seemed so far off, but now we're just like, man, that was really speculative, and maybe the truth is stranger than fiction. I know I myself have always been a huge fan of fantasy, sci-fi, horror, things that would just be considered strict genre. And I think there's always, like, as a child, in general, it's like you weren't considered, like a hard reader unless you were reading the classics, or unless, this is all well and good as long as it's, I guess, like specific genre books that are considered literary, but also they're still lesser than books that have no genre in them. And I think we're just kind of in this really interesting time where maybe that's shifting a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you brought up childhood, because I was trying to think about how I saw genre as a kid. And I feel like I didn't necessarily pay that much attention to it. Like maybe this was just me as a kid, or maybe a lot of like super bookworm kids are like this. But I would just be really interested in any book, like it would grab my attention. And yeah, I think as a kid, when I picked up a book, it was more just like, ooh, like this looks interesting. Like the cover, like I would read a little bit about it. I guess I had a very general understanding of like, okay, if I'm reading The Hobbit, that's like fantasy. If I'm reading Little Women, it's historical fiction, I guess. Um,
Yeah.
I had like a very broad sense, but I didn't really limit myself or hold myself back from exploring different stories. Like I understood the differences between them in terms of what I was getting, but it didn't feel like I had a particular loyalty to any one genre. Like I really, really loved reading different books that caught my attention based kind of on the story. And it probably wasn't until I was a little bit older, probably when I was applying to MFA programs myself, when I was in my early 20s, that I really hurtled into the idea of like literary fiction and genre fiction. And then that became like kind of a big part of the way I thought about writing and about reading, which I feel like it was to my detriment, because it's a very confusing way to think about writing in a certain way. And when I look back, I can see how being too obsessed with genre, or like especially this split between literary fiction and genre fiction, acting as if like literary fiction in and of itself is not a genre with its own conventions and its own
Exactly.
stereotypes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's what I've come to realize. But it was like the first time I saw somebody say that, I was like, oh, wait a second. Like, that's absolutely true. Because in my head, there was like this binary of like, over here is literary fiction, and over here is like all the other genres, which includes just so many genres that are so different from each other in certain ways. And it's very weird to me now to look at it and be like, how can you say there's like, literary fiction all over,
Right.
all alone, and then
Yeah.
like everything else. And it set up a very strange like dichotomy in my head when I wrote, especially since I don't think it's a secret that it can kind of be used as a way of like snobbery or gatekeeping, and that it can very much be like literary fiction is like superior and
Yeah.
it doesn't really need labels because it does whatever it wants, and like it's just a very, very good book, like it's well written. And then genre fiction is like, it might sell well, but it's like not as highbrow, it's not as prestigious,
But
it's like
that's just
more
the
formulaic.
thing. Yeah, like when you look at certain phenomenon, it's usually the genre that's driving, if you're looking at it from a sales point of view, I mean, the things that really catch on tends to be genre related. I mean, even now, like when of course Game of Thrones had been out for a really long time before the TV series, but the TV series comes out and then all of a sudden like everybody wants the next Game of Thrones, and you see all of these, these series, and this is like a Game of Thrones type series, but set in, just with different cultural retellings. And it's right now we're kind of in like a horror true crime renaissance,
Yes.
where
Yeah.
even everything even slight is sort of true crime-esque or even slightly horror-esque. Like I was recently watching The Shrink Next Door, which is based on a podcast that's true crime, but I saw an author who's a horror author whose name is escaping me at the moment. tweet something about how it's psychological horror, and it kind of is, so it's really very interesting because I mean, for me, it's so interesting to hear you talk about this as a writer, because as a reader, as a child, I was considered a non-reader because what I read was not like considered, I guess, highbrow enough. I mean, I
Oh no.
wanted, yeah, I was just not like, there were a lot of stuff that I was just not really interested in. But then when I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, like there was like, I really liked the fantasy aspect of it. And I was at the time 100% aware of any, 100% unaware of any allegorical part of it, which it was like the story itself, it was just such a great idea of, you could be this normal child and you can open your closet and end up in Narnia, which is just so cool. But, it was more like, okay, well, that was fun, but, like you should be reading this instead, that you like that. So read this very straightforward thing. And it's not to knock the very straightforward thing, but I think the idea of escapism is really important. And sometimes escapism is a really good way to also make a backdoor point about something really important.
Yeah, I was thinking about this while I was, researching genre. Just this kind of point that we tend to hold literary fiction in like higher regard because the conventional wisdom is that literary fiction deals with like character more than plot. It deals with like the human mind and psychology, and we are impressed by that. And then like the idea is that genre fiction is more focused on plot. And for me, I couldn't help thinking, there's this quote by like Nathaniel Hawthorne that I love because it sounds like it's one of those misattributed quotes because it doesn't sound like him at all. But apparently he really did say it, which is like easy reading is damn hard writing. And it just made me think like we're so impressed by writers who can really, really get inside characters' minds and really delve into like the human condition. And I also am very impressed by that. It's no small feat. But I feel like genre writers, by focusing a little bit more on plot, I feel like that's really hard to pull off. Like that is not something that's like lesser than or inferior. It takes a lot of craft, it takes a lot of talent. And I think it takes getting into the reader's mind in a lot of ways too. Because I mean, there have been books that on a sentence level, maybe they weren't like blowing me away with their poetry. But like I will look up from them and be like, I just read this in like an afternoon. Like I couldn't stop thinking about it. It really feels like to be able to create a plot that just pulls somebody in and is so immersive is, I don't understand why we've decided that that's like something that should market as not being as smart, or a reason that we should like not respect the writers of that as much, or not give them like the fancy awards and recognitions and everything. Because to me, I feel like having attended an MFA program, and like to be clear, I attended my MFA program like quite a long time ago. When I think about it, like I graduated like 12 years ago now, and it was a really lovely experience. And I do think that my professors were interested in different genres and were pretty open-minded. But I've heard horror stories from other programs, and in general, there's just this idea that like plot is something kind of embarrassing that like comes in and like gets in the way of a good story, or like if you're focusing too much on plot, it's like kind of beneath what you should be doing as like an artist. And I'm like, I think sometimes when people say that, they're just saying it to avoid the fact that like plot is incredibly tricky.
Oh,
And like,
absolutely. I mean, I wonder sometimes, like how people put these threads together, because really, like when you're going, I don't know, like I'm trying to think of a good analogy. Like when you're going on a trip, you have like the driver, you have the car, and you have the destination. But like, like the scenery is really important. The route you're going to take is really
Yeah.
important. Where you're going to stop for dinner is really important. And everything along the way. And you don't really have a trip unless you have a good part of each woven in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's so much that you have to balance when you're writing. Like, it always reminds me of like putting a bed sheet on a bed, and like the way you'll be like, yes, I have this corner perfect. And then you'll look across and be like, oh, like I focus so much on this aspect of the story. And like, I let, the other part slide. Like I focus so much on character that I let the plot kind of go off the rails a little bit, or, vice versa. I feel like it's a very challenging process, and I think it is changing, which makes me very happy. But I think like this overall attitude that there are writers who focus less on their craft, or who don't put forth as much effort, or like it's not as difficult for them, that attitude is really, really frustrating to me, because I think every writer across all different genres, including literary fiction, just I think that it's such a balance to pull off. And whatever genre you're doing it in, to me, it's like pretty incredible.
I think one thing that to me is really amazing about genre, and I think people don't really give enough credit to, is the fact that it requires people to want to suspend disbelief. I mean,
Yeah.
there's some situations where it's like it's so it's like it's speculative. There's some science behind it, and then there's some situations where it might be a little bit not so much, but you're still putting faith in the reader that they're going to suspend disbelief, and the reader is putting faith in the writer that they're going to give up to it, and just say, you know what, I'm going into this and I'm going to trust that your plot and the world that you're building is going to make me want to suspend this disbelief.
Yeah, that is, I mean, it's kind of a little bit of a magic act in a way. Like, just, yeah, that level of trust that you have to take on as a writer. Sometimes I admit I'm a little bit jealous, I guess, of literary fiction writers, but just anybody who writes. I mean, it doesn't have to be literary fiction, because as I'm thinking of it, it's like this also applies to like thriller or crime. But just the idea that you're sort of grounded in this world very strongly, so you kind of already have all this groundwork done for you. I think trying to figure out how much you need to explain about the rules of your world. You're like, am I just dumping all this exposition on them, trying to get them to buy this world or the way that this world works? Like, is it going to be too boring, or are they going to go along with it? Those establishing whether you're like creating an entire new world, or you're just adding a piece into the existing world that we kind of all share. I think that's kind of a daunting task. So I definitely get that sense of like, oh, like maybe one day I should try writing a book where there's not like a speculative element, just to see, like, maybe I'm kidding myself. Like, maybe every writer looks at other writers and it's like, oh, I bet it would be much easier. I bet it would be much more straightforward to do X or Y or Z. And then you get there and you're like, oh no, wait, like, all of writing has its own challenges. Like, there's no secret formula to write in one genre and make it a lot easier. It's always going to be tricky in one way or another. But I do, that world building and that trust that you talked about is like it's a pretty huge task, as someone who writes like sci-fi, fantasy, like speculative fiction.
I mean, I have to say, so, and I want to get into like some of your favorite just genre fiction books, like I guess like from childhood up. But I thought that the one of the previews or blurbs for your book the girl one kind of described it as like The Handmaid's Tale meets
Yeah.
Orphan Black,
Yeah.
which I absolutely loved Orphan Black like so much. And I was like, oh, this is really good. But I will say, so Orphan Black, for those who don't know, is actually a TV series, which came out a while ago, about somebody who finds out that she's a clone and she has to interact with other versions of herself. And it is just one of the most brilliantly acted TV shows ever. I mean, there is one, Tatiana Maslany is one person and she plays like 12, and sometimes it's seamless. Like you can't see one character that she's playing as she's playing another. You forget you're watching the same person. But like, so as much as I loved Orphan Black, there were some inconsistencies that were just really difficult for me. And I was like, oh, come on. Like, I know, because I've been rewatching this, I know that that is inconsistent, that that character's backstory is actually this, because I just watched this, you know, the 2 seasons ago with my friend the other week. But like, then something just, it was very difficult for me to give it up in spite of that. And usually for me, plot holes or inconsistencies are just the death of a story. But there was just so much else going on in the world that I don't want to necessarily say I forgave it, but I was just willing to sort of put it aside with a grumble and just continue to watch the show. And I mean that figuratively and also just in a story sense. I really just wanted to see how things unfolded. And in the sense of, because of the world being part of what happened to the characters and affecting how they are, I care too much about the characters to let it go. So, you know, when you were talking about professors saying that concentrating on plot is sort of like almost like implying like it's giving up on your characters, that just seems so unfair.
Yeah. And, you know, I always wonder what it's like specifically for like TV writers, because I feel like they must collaborate so much. And I have no idea what it would be like to be in that situation and be like bouncing ideas off of other people. And then maybe some writers leave and others come on and they have to pick up, you know, and it's almost like a game of telephone. I think in a lot of ways it would be really fun to collaborate. Sometimes, you know, I collaborate with like my editor and with beta readers, but to just have that level of input would be really fun. But I'm sure it's also a little bit daunting in terms of like keeping things consistent. So I can totally see that. But yeah, I think the character and plot really do work so strongly together. I think there's so many different aspects of writing that we kind of try to isolate and talk about, yeah, just in isolation, so that we can improve at X or Y or Z. But really the reality is that all of those elements work together so closely. And I mean, plot, like for me, that's something that I am always working on, is trying to make sure that my characters are guiding the plot a little bit more, to make sure that like their choices and reactions are pushing that engine forward versus like kind of dropping them down into this super like, I don't know, pre-designed world in which like, even if this is inconsistent with who you are, like in this chapter, this has to happen. So like it or not, you know, that's going to happen. But they are so like, they're so bound together that, you know, yeah, now you're having me thinking like how odd it is to have that distinction because I think that's just like, really, if you look up like what is genre fiction, what is literary fiction, it's like literary fiction focuses on character, genre fiction focuses on plot. But I'm like, of course those two things are just like completely melded together. Like it's really difficult to
I
have
know,
one without the
yeah.
other.
And thinking about it in general, just because I kind of want to talk a little bit, I mean, you know, I've recently read 2 novels where literary fiction is so a specific literary fiction property, which just came, I guess, on the public domain, The Great Gatsby, is set against genre. And you know, the Great Gatsby, like there a plot plays a huge role in that, and I would find it a hard sell to say that that isn't literary fiction, or at least considered it now, maybe not at
Yeah.
the time. But like if the certain, like if you had to, I'm thinking of that whole TikTok meme now where they take that from The Emperor's New Groove, where it's like you have to do this to find Cusco, and if you do this, you find, like Myrtle had to see the car with Tom in it to run out. I mean, spoiler alert:
Yeah.
the Great Gatsby is over 100 years old at this point, but like, and Daisy had to go home with Gatsby in order for this. It all had to work together. Plot had to work in order for the tragedy of how things end in that story to end. And what I love about the remixes is that they have, like we're talking fan fiction now in a way. Like you have this tapestry and you have this thing that's already considered highbrow and literary fiction, and you have the plot, but what they're doing is they're adding to the characterization because of what's changing. I mean, in one situation, Jill Cantor makes it almost like a murder mystery. So it's a little bit more like crime fiction, where the question is, well, what if Gatsby didn't die in the way that we thought he did? What if there were other things at play? And because we were so busy focusing on that, we missed other plot points. And the other one, The Chosen and the Beautiful, Niveau, I believe, is the pronunciation of her name. It's like a sci-fi with like a little bit of like a slight horror tinge to it, because it has to do with
Cool.
and fairies, but it's a little bit more science fiction, and it also deals with the character of Jordan being adopted from Vietnam, and because there's a lot about I guess Tom Buchanan's white supremacy, because he's reading these books. So like here are people who are taking this plot and sort of working backwards in order to develop characters that they feel like maybe were undeveloped or overlooked. So it's weird to me to see it, but it's also kind of cool. So what are some of your favorite genres and some of your favorite genre books?
Ooh, that's a fun question. After I went through my like largely self-inflicted like MFA snobbery, I really came back to my absolute love of reading by just focusing on like thrillers. Like this would have been, in 2011, 2012, when I was just like really getting back into reading for, I guess, for pleasure, and just like not caring at all, just like freeing myself from these like very ridiculous limitations that I sometimes put on myself. And I read like Gone Girl, and I really, really loved it. And then I went back and read more of Flynn's books, and I started noticing that I feel like Flynn's prose is actually really sharp and really lovely. Like she has like very she writes in kind of more of a noir style. Like she's clearly not trying to write like lyrical poetic work, but like it's very funny, it's very punchy. Like just on a sentence level, I was just like so drawn in by it. And I had that experience that I'll have sometimes with like literary fiction, where you really love the story, but you're also pausing sometimes just to like really admire a sentence, just because you're like, wow. And that kind of made me look more into other thriller writers. And somebody recommended Tana French to me, which I'm forever indebted to that person. Because like I just came home, like, I got like a copy of, now I'm going to say Into the Woods, but it's In the Woods. I always get those two mixed up.
Yeah.
Yeah, In the Woods, and like kind of started reading it, like not quite knowing, what it would be like. And I think I stayed up truly until like some time of night where I could not keep my eyes open, and I was like actively fighting off sleep because I just was so pulled in by her mystery. And she actually is a really interesting example of someone who plays around with genre, because she's written, like, is it 9 books now, or is it 7?
A lot of
So
books.
many.
And they're always in high demand at the library.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah, I'm one of those people who's like really fanatical about Tana French. But some of her books, some of the books that she's written, they're really intriguing to me because she lets herself play around with the genre at least a little bit. Like In the Woods and Secret Place have very, very strong, like, supernatural, speculative, like, mystical elements. And then others of her books are like such grounded, like, police procedural thrillers. They pretty much have no whiff of like anything supernatural.
But
And
police
yet,
procedural is a genre.
yeah.
Absolutely. Like,
Oh
yeah.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, because like so she writes like in these multiple genres where sometimes they're like kind of blended together, and sometimes they seem like super straightforward, like this is a crime book and a procedural, and it kind of ticks off like everything you would expect of that kind of book. But what's really fascinating to me about that is that all her books take place very much in like the same world. Like the characters show up, like a minor character will become the narrator. Um, so there's like this suggestion that they're all these characters are like living in the same world, which I feel like is our world, but some of them experience a very supernatural, like kind of horror tinged or like
Yeah.
almost fantasy tinged experience, and others have no awareness of that, which I find so fascinating.
Yeah.
um just that, like, it kind of, I don't know, it kind of gives this sense you can create a universe as an author where people can share experiences and yet walk away and live in different genres, which I think is kind of true of a lot of us, is that we
Well,
might be living in different genres.
yeah, I was going to say that as well. I mean, when you watch, I mean, clearly, okay, so documentaries are often sort of edited to make them more dramatic, or to
Yeah.
make them, maybe the takes aren't 100% across the board. But when you're watching something, for instance, like, I don't know, I just finished, man, it was crazy. I just finished The Way Down, which is a documentary on um HBO Max about a cult that started as like a weight loss system.
Oh
I mean,
yeah.
to me, that, if someone was to tell me everything about that, and even just, what happened in it, I would have not imagined that that could possibly be somebody's reality, but it was. I mean, as tragic as certain of the, situations are, like, when people get taken up in these scams, be it like buy a ton of Lula Row and you think you're going to be rich, but you're also kind of, I don't know, like in a cult and you didn't even realize it.
Yeah.
um like that, to me, when you're on the outside of that, you're sitting there and you're like, how, this isn't reality, how can this be reality? But it is. And you have people who have just different experiences, that, like, to them, I mean, you might be like, oh well, that was a shadow that you saw, but to them it was purely supernatural. So it's a real, it's really interesting when you think about it. I guess everybody kind of lives in their own genre. But I like that you described that for Tana French, because I think you're right. It is very true to life. Like, not everybody has, certainly, like, ridden a dragon like Daenerys Targaryen, but there's certainly people who have been either underestimated by their family, or maybe I don't know, like just different situations have gone in different ways and they emerge differently, like it's all very relative, and it is character driven. Like that's just another thing that just keeps coming up in this conversation.
Yeah.
It is very character driven.
Yeah, I almost feel like characters are kind of the ones who define the genre in a certain way, because, one situation in reality can be like horror for the one person and like complete like fantasy for another. There are just so many situations in which we're experiencing things in entirely different ways. Um,
I found like so for myself, like I said, like I started reading The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and
oh
I always
yeah,
liked things that were fantasy, but like maybe a little bit darker, even like with my media. So, but it took me a really long time to just become like a reader. And I think when I was just not concentrating so much on whether or not what I was enjoying was legitimate, sort of brought me to becoming a reader, and then obviously a librarian. Nowadays, like I read a lot of horror. I read a lot of like Riley Sager. I read a lot of thrillers because I feel like they keep my mind busy.
yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah. But yeah, and I found it interesting because I feel like a lot of the major publishers are starting to really like push the imprints of their genre fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we really are kind of shifting into an era where it feels almost expected to have a little more freedom with genre, which I really love. Yeah, because when I was looking at books, yeah, you can make arguments for so many different books being like genre blending. I feel like Sarah Gailey writes
Sarah
books that are,
Gailey is so good. And I saw
yeah.
that their newest book is going to be horror, which is fab. First of all, Sarah
Oh,
Gailey's genres are out of this world because
yeah.
they're almost like microcosms of themselves. I mean, the fact that they had an entire series based on alternate history
Yes.
with
Yeah,
hippos
I
being
love
in
that.
the Mississippi River is wild. And then to find out that that was more almost like speculative in a way, because that almost happened, is even wilder.
Yeah.
But I mean, the Echo Wife, which I think I read very shortly before or after I read Girl One, they were almost like spiritual sisters in my mind because they both involved cloning.
Yeah.
But the fact that they approached the topic so differently and it was great. And even like going back to like the Possessions, your first book, which was I super almost supernatural, but so
Yeah.
grounded in persona and people that it almost could like slip by somebody. And were you at all worried about that being written off as quote unquote genre?
I definitely ran into some issues, I think, with genre, with like the genre of the Possessions, maybe less so with Girl One, but it's always hard for me to say whether it really was less of an issue or if I've just like developed a thicker skin or I'm just calmer about things the second time around. I do think that when I wrote the Possessions, I was really drawing off, like I said, I had felt like this big revival of like my love for reading and writing when I started really getting into like thrillers and particularly domestic suspense, and you can really see that influence in the Possessions. And I just kind of wrote this story that I wanted to write. It was the story that I'd had in my head, like when I thought of the idea for the Possessions and this organization where you can talk to the dead, and what it would be like for the workers there. Like I instantly thought of this, like what it would be like for this romance to develop between one of the workers and somebody who's like grieving his wife. Um, and then when it was published, yeah, it was like, I think it was it was kind of a strange process to see how it was categorized by other people. Like, I think it was romantic suspense, you know, sometimes it's shelved under like ghost stories, which of course, you know, is very flattering because I absolutely love ghosts. I don't think it was ever really, it wasn't categorized too heavily as horror, but I think sometimes it was. And I mean, even crime, like I've seen the possessions counted as crime, and I've seen Girl One counted as crime. And both of them definitely
that's
have.
true.
Yeah.
Now that I'm thinking everything through, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see
Yeah.
that. Yes, there we go.
It was surprising to me though, because like even though of course they both do, I mean, no spoilers, but they both do involve crimes occurring at various points, like I don't feel like that's the like heart of either story.
It's not the central part, but you know, it's like it's a little something for everybody.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
So I guess just to sort of wrap up, because I could probably talk to you about this for another 3 hours. So going forward, so are you like, do you feel like the tides are turning just with how people are looking at genre fiction? Do you think like as you continue to write, you're more comfortable with it?
I think so. Yeah. I feel like a lot of, you know, it's definitely not an atmosphere anymore where I think writing genre fiction is going to get you too sidelined. I do think that kind of if you're writing stories that really resonate with people, I do think that you will find your readers, and I think, you know, you'll have a place at the table. It is tricky for me as a writer to kind of figure it out because one of the things I've noticed is that you can often be expected as a writer to kind of stick in a similar vein. And sometimes people kind of break out of it a little bit. Occasionally people will break out, but will use like pen names for different genres, which I always find really interesting. There's the X Hex, which I like saw so much positive buzz about.
But yes, I interviewed quote unquote Erin Sterling.
Yeah.
But it was so funny because when the X Hex came up, it was very shortly after I read the book and then just did a little research where I was like, oh, this is also Rachel Hawkins. And I read Rachel Hawkins books way before the X Hex. So
yeah, I hadn't realized that it was Rachel Hawkins either. And then I was like, oh, wait a second. Okay. And I thought that was really cool that she's like exploring different genres. I can feel like a little bit hemmed in by it sometimes because there are times where like I really would love to explore an entirely different genre. And I'm like, should I, you know, it could be a little risky. Like, should I stick with what I'm already doing? And I feel like I personally have a fair bit of leeway because the books that I've written so far have mostly been like grounded, but with speculative elements. And a lot of the ideas that I have as a writer fit very neatly into that kind of speculative genre blending category. I guess that's just kind of how my imagination works.
right.
But I think sometimes, you know, if I get an idea that I'm like, oh wait, this would be like very pure fantasy, or I get an idea and I'm like, oh, this would be like very grounded, like this is an idea that really wouldn't have any room for like speculative elements. It would just be kind of straightforward crime fiction or straightforward literary fiction. You know, there is that little voice at the back of your head that's like, like, should I try to jump into a different lane? And I think that, you know, I think that writers should follow as much as possible, like should follow like the idea that really grabs their attention and grabs their imagination. And I really feel like it's a very welcoming atmosphere out there for genre fiction and for people who like put different genres together. Like the fact that we're so into like the idea of genre blending, and like it's it's not quite expected, but like definitely not surprising to have people publish a book that can fit into like 5 different spots on the library shelves or the bookstore shelves. Like, I think it's kind of exciting, and I'm grateful to be writing during a time when that's true, and to be reading during a time when that's true,
Me
because
too.
I love reading it.
Are you working on anything now? I'm trying to recall our last chat.
I finished a complete draft, and now I'm jumping into revisions on a 3rd book that is also like very speculative.
Yay.
More of a coming of age speculative story, more so than like sci-fi, like Girl One or gothic fiction like The Possessions.
I do
If this
think
one,
but Girl One had some coming of age aspects
that's
to
true.
it. A lot
Yeah.
a lot of it was about revisiting your childhood and what you
Yeah.
remember and what people remember, what other people's experiences were of the same situation versus your own, and also questioning parental figures.
Very much so. Yeah, that's a really good point. It is a coming of age story too. Like every time I think about my own books, I'm like, oh yeah, they could kind of fit here, they could kind of fit there. But so many books I read are like that. Because I think all stories are so complex, and they draw on so many different aspects of the human experience, I guess, or the non-human experience if they have non-human narrators. But yeah, I think it's just a very rich world to draw from, and if writers feel more free to not be hemmed in, but like pull from whatever toolkit they need to tell the story that they want, I mean, it seems to only ever have a positive effect, really.
Thank you so much. Once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries from the Page podcast. Our guest was
Sara Flannery Murphy.
And I do hope that you'll come back and talk to us about to be named, or I'm sure there's a name, but you might not be able to release it yet, book that you are working on now.
Oh, I would be honored.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.